Good morning, brethren. Welcome to another new week and another devotional. We're going to move on this morning and consider Psalm 44, or at least begin to consider it. Some of you are of a certain vintage, like myself, who can remember a television programme. It ran from the 1950s through until about the mid-1980s. It was called The Good Old Days. It was recorded at the Leeds City Varieties Theatre, and each week it was hosted by Leonard Sachs. That programme recreated the authentic atmosphere of a Victorian Edwardian music hall entertainment night. And all who went along to the performance dressed in period costume, and they would join in the singing whenever the artist was performing. For many people going to that show, it was a walk down memory lane. It was remembering the good old days of light entertainment. And in many ways, it was a longing for a return to such light entertainment in the light of what was going on by way of so-called entertainment in the 70s and the 80s. Psalm 44 could be entitled The Good Old Days. It's a psalm in which the people of God look back and remember when things were far better. Days when the blessing of God upon them was evident for all to see. And there was a longing in the nation for a return of such days. We're going to see that in verses 1 to 3 this morning. Let me read those verses to you. O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You, with your own hand, drove out the nations, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. For not by their own sword did they win the land, nor did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm and the light of your face, for you delighted in them. The psalm was written by the sons of Korah. They were the God-appointed worship leaders of God's people in the Old Testament era. And here they put into verse the thoughts of the people as a whole. In these opening 3 verses, they are looking back to days long ago, better days when it was so evident that God was with his people, that God was blessing his people. The sons of Korah, who wrote this psalm, and their contemporaries, were not, of course, alive at the time to see these things. But their fathers and their grandfathers had told them of what had happened. They had related to them these stories of how God had manifested his power on their behalf against their enemies, how he brought them out of Egypt, how he drove the nations out of Canaan, how he gave them the land, how he granted them great victories over their enemies. And this all happened not by their own power or their own strength or their own strategies, but simply by God working for them, in them, and through them. God, in his wonderful grace and power, was blessing his people abundantly. He caused his people to flourish. He gave them victories, and this was evident for everyone to see. Verse 3 at the end says, because you delighted in them. Now, as we'll see in our next devotional, things at the time of the writing of this psalm were very different from they were as described in verses 1 to 3. And these verses are a longing for the return of those days. As Christians, we sometimes long for the good old days. We read about how God worked through his people in such a way that life in the past was much more God-centered than it is today. We read of how the Bible was respected by the vast majority of people in our land, how the Sabbath was observed as a special day by most of the nation. We remember how churches used to be well filled every Lord's Day, and how public morality was much more in keeping with the principles laid down in the Ten Commandments. We read of how people were much less selfish, where family life was much more important. You would hardly have heard of a divorce. Abortions were very few. Having a child outside of marriage was a scandal. And as Christians, we look back to times of great revival, and we see that happening in places like Scotland and England, and even, yes, here in Northern Ireland in 1859. And like the psalmist and his contemporaries, we ourselves long for such days. We didn't ourselves live through them, but we have been able to read the records of such days. And we think to ourselves, Lord, do it again. This psalm shows us that it's not wrong to have such longings. But we must not dwell on the past. We're to live in the present as God's people, while praying for God to once again work on our behalf. One thing is for sure, days of refreshing, days of revival will only come through God acting. We ourselves cannot manufacture or achieve such revival by ourselves. No amount of revival meetings, no amount of planning and organising will see such a revival happening. It only comes by the power of God. We see that again in verse 3. For not by their own sword did they win the land, nor did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm, the light of your face, for you delighted in them. Perhaps the reason we're not seeing God working in mighty ways in our day, in our land, is because maybe God is not delighted in us. Let us pray that we, God's people, might change. But let us also pray that our great and mighty God might act and might work once again in our day as he did in the past. May God help us to so desire these things and so pray for them, that perhaps in our day we might see them. Every blessing.